What does a mother believe can still be saved when she brings her own son into court and asks the law to teach him the respect she can no longer reach inside her own home? I have lived with that question for 2 years now. I do not know the full answer. I only know this case is why I keep asking it. Let me tell you the case. There were 3 moments in that courtroom when the room went fully still. Not the quiet that comes between one sentence and the next. I mean the kind that settles after something true has entered the room and no one knows yet how to move around it. I still remember this case through those 3 silences. Everything else is what led us into them. The hearing was on Monday, March 4th, 2024, a little after 9 in the morning in Providence, Rhode Island. On my docket it looked plain: disorderly conduct, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, property damage tied to the same event, a short file, a small case number. On paper it did not look like a family coming apart one refusal at a time. It looked like paperwork. I have held this story for a long time, not because I was afraid to tell it, because I wanted to tell it right. Subscribe and turn on notifications. That is the only reason I am here today, to tell it right to the right people. Subscribe before I keep going. Her name was Elena Rivera. She was 46, worked nights cleaning offices downtown, and when she walked into my courtroom, the first thing I noticed was how carefully she held the strap of her purse with both hands, not tight with fear, tight with habit, the kind of habit people learn when they have spent too long bracing for the next sharp thing inside a place that should have been restful. When she sat down, she took a folded grocery receipt from her coat pocket and flattened it on the table with the side of her hand. She was not reading it. She just wanted one thing in front of her to lie still. That is the kind of detail many people miss. I do not. I had seen enough people come before me to know that when someone tries to make one small corner of the world orderly, it usually means another part of life has not felt orderly for a long time. Her son was Marcus Rivera, 18 years old, tall, thin, tired in the face the way young men sometimes look when they have been getting through their days by treating everything as temporary. When he entered at 9/11, he did not look at his mother first. He looked at the side door, then the camera in the back, then down at the loose thread on his sleeve. He kept rubbing that thread with his thumb when he thought nobody was marking him. From the bench, I was marking him. There was one thing about Marcus that morning that made him more human to me, and because of that made the case worse rather than better. His mother pulled her chair out too hard, it stuck, and without looking at her, he reached over and loosened it for her, a reflex. A small act of care still alive in him. That mattered because it meant he had not grown up without tenderness. He knew what care looked like, he just was not bringing it with him when it counted. The incident happened on Wednesday, January 17, 2024, at 7:18 p.m., outside apartment 2B, 114 Dexter Street on the west side of Providence. I know the time because Elena called her sister at 7:19, and she called 911 at 7:22. Those records were entered. What she first called disrespect when she filed the complaint had turned into something the law could name more exactly by the time the police wrote it down. She had come home with groceries and found Marcus asking for the keys to her 2011 Toyota Camry. He had a learner's permit, not a full license, and he had already been warned twice for driving without a properly licensed adult in the car. She said no. She said he had skipped school again, and she needed the car for work the next morning. He said, "It's just a car, and you're my mother, not the police." He took the keys from the hook by the door. When she moved in front of him, he pulled past her, and his shoulder hit a narrow entry table. A framed photograph of Elena and her late husband, Daniel Rivera, slid off the table and broke against a radiator pipe. Elena said he looked back once and kept going. I believe that. People often reveal themselves most clearly in the glance they do not think will matter later. She followed him outside in house slippers and an unbuttoned winter coat. 2 neighbors saw what happened next. Elena said, "Marcus, bring me my keys and come upstairs." He said, "Stop making this a whole thing." That was one of the quietest sentences in the case, and one of the clearest. Harm often tries to make itself sound smaller before it leaves the room. He backed the Camry out too fast, clipped a Blue City trash barrel, and bent the rear bumper on the passenger side. Then he drove off toward Cranston Street. Elena was left in the lot with a broken grocery bag and eggs rolling under a parked van. A neighbor later said she was on her knees picking up eggs in the dark. I wrote that down because some sentences tell you more than emotion words ever could. He came back at 11:03 p.m. There was a parking ticket on the windshield from Broad Street, the gas tank was nearly empty, and Elena had chained the apartment door. She let him in because the neighbors were awake and it was cold. During testimony, he said, "I was going to bring her food back, so it wasn't like I forgot she existed." He meant it to sound considerate. It did not. It told me he thought intention could do the work that respect had refused to do. I want to ask you to subscribe before I go further. And I want you to know that I do not ask lightly. What comes next in this story is the part that cost me the most to say out loud. Subscribe. Stay with it. The legal process began 2 days later, on January 19, 2024, at 8:43 a.m., when Elena signed a sworn complaint. Most people do not know what changes when that happens. A family problem does not stop being a family problem, but it becomes more than private pain. Once a complaint is sworn, the court is saying the public now has an interest in what happened. That is a hard line for any mother to cross against her own child. What crossed my desk first was not grief. It was a packet, photographs of the broken frame, a repair estimate for the car, $1,286.40, the parking citation, a police narrative, Elena's handwritten statement on lined paper. The law called the case unauthorized use, disorderly conduct, and property damage. But in her own statement she wrote, "I brought him because the house does not sound like home when he is there." The law could not charge that sentence. I still read it as central. I can order consequences. I cannot hand a family back the version of itself that existed before contempt learned the layout of the home. From the bench, I saw both entrances in a way no one else could. Elena came through the courtroom door and looked, not at me, but at the row of seats behind counsel table. She checked the empty chairs first. She was looking for who had not come with her. Marcus entered 12 steps later, saw the split seam on the toe of her slipper, and looked away. Small things like that matter. They tell me what people see and what they choose not to answer. Then came the first silence. I asked Elena why she had filed. I asked it plainly because plain language is often where truth arrives. She stood up, folded her hands, and said, "I did not bring my son here because I hate him. I brought him here because I am disappearing in my own house." Then she sat down before anyone told her to. The room went completely quiet for about 6 seconds. I know the length because when you sit where I sat for enough years, you learn the rough measure of silence. The clerk stopped moving papers. Marcus stopped touching the thread on his sleeve. The court officer near the wall shifted his weight more slowly than before. The silence broke when Elena cleared her throat and said very softly, "I am sorry," though she had nothing to apologize for. After that, the evidence changed shape for me. Before that silence, I had a file about keys, a car, broken glass, and a parking lot argument. After that silence, I understood I was looking at erosion, not one bad night, not one loud exchange. Erosion, the slow kind, the kind that teaches one person to take and the other person to shrink. The first wave of proof was simple: photos, repair bill, parking citation from 8:06 p.m. on Broad Street, testimony from Mrs. Baptiste and Eric Mendez placing Marcus behind the wheel and Elena in the lot. Marcus did not deny taking the car. He said, "I live there too. I wasn't stealing from some stranger." That sentence mattered because it showed me how he understood access, not as trust given, as something owed. A point many people do not know is that unauthorized use is not the same as permanent theft. You do not have to plan to keep a car forever to violate the law. If I take your keys after you said no, use your car, damage it, and bring it back later, the return does not erase the taking. The law can see that difference, and on good days it says so clearly. If something in what I have said so far has stayed in your chest, subscribe, because what I am about to tell you next will stay longer. Subscribe now and then let me keep going. The defense was careful. It argued age, family strain, poor judgment, no physical injury, and the danger of letting a rough household night become public punishment. I listened seriously because that is part of my duty. The defense said Marcus had acted immaturely, not maliciously. It said Elena had let him back into the apartment that same night, which showed the danger was not what the complaint now suggested. That gave me real pause. It mattered that she let him in. It suggested the line between injury and attachment was still moving inside that family. But the pause ended when I thought about why she had opened that chain. It was late. The building was awake. The cold was real. Mothers do not stop being mothers because they have reached the end of private patience. Letting him in at 11:03 did not make the earlier taking smaller. It made her burden clearer. When Marcus testified, he tried very hard to sound measured. That is often when people tell me more than they mean to tell me. He said, "I was only talking loud because she kept putting her hands near me." I wrote it down. I looked at it for a long time before I moved on to the next page. It was a sentence built to sound reasonable while moving the center of blame a few inches away from him. Later he said, "She knows I always bring the car back." That word always did a great deal of work. It told me this had happened before, if not with the exact same facts, then with the same attitude. Return had become his excuse for taking. Familiarity had become his defense against consent. Once I understood that, the case became harder and clearer. While he was on the stand, a memory from my own life came back to me with no warning. I was 14 in my mother's kitchen on a wet Thursday evening. There were onions in a pan. She had one shoe off because her foot hurt after work. I said something sharp to her about where I was going, something small and ugly. She did not answer. She turned the flame down and put her hand on the chair before sitting. I remember the chair making one dry sound against the floor. I remember seeing for 1 second the cost of my own voice. I do not explain that memory. I only place it beside this case because that is what happened. It returned to me while Marcus was speaking, and it stood there next to Elena's grocery receipt, her split slipper, and the broken photograph of a dead husband on a radiator pipe. Then came the second silence. It arrived after Marcus's last answer. I asked why he thought taking the keys was acceptable. He said, "I figured she'd calm down after I got back." Then he gave one small shrug, as if time itself had a duty to do his repairing for him. The room went silent for about 4 seconds. Shorter than the first silence, sharper, colder. The first silence came from pain finally speaking plain. The second came from pretense running out. In that quiet, I understood something the whole room understood with me. Elena had not come to court because one night got out of hand. She had come because her son had learned to wait for her pain to pass and call that peace. There is a difference between conflict and disregard. The second silence removed the last confusion between them. One witness had said earlier, almost in passing, he talked like the night had to adjust itself around him. I wrote that in my own handwriting across the bottom of the page. It was not fancy language, it was exact. Exact language is what I trust most in rooms like that. Subscribe before I go further. I have more to tell, and the more I tell, the more it matters that someone is listening. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Then let me continue. After the testimony, I folded my hands over the file and sat with it. I had made this decision carefully. I had made it knowing that careful decisions and right decisions are not always the same thing, and believing that here they were. I found Marcus responsible on the unauthorized use complaint, the disorderly conduct charge, and the property damage tied to the broken frame and bent bumper. I said his name first. Then I said, "I am ordering you to pay restitution of $1,286.40 for the repair of your mother's vehicle and $213.60 for replacement of the broken frame and glass, and I am imposing an additional fine of $850 to be paid to the Sojourner House Family Support Fund in Providence." I wanted him to hear the numbers as numbers, not abstractions. I said money does not restore trust, but harm that made life less stable needs to meet something concrete. You damaged property, yes, but you also damaged a person's sense that her work, her time, and her own refusal would be respected. This fine goes to a place that helps families when the inside of home has started to turn uncertain. Then I said, I am suspending your learner's permit and any driving privilege for 9 months, effective today, and you may not operate any vehicle owned or insured by your mother for 12 months. He looked up quickly at that. I kept going. That means no quick trips, no borrowed keys, no short favors, no pretending permission has returned because a week has passed. I said, you used movement like it belonged to you. For the next 9 months, movement will require planning, waiting, asking, and inconvenience. I want the limit to teach you what a limit is. Then I said, I am ordering 120 hours of community service with Meals on Wheels of Rhode Island, specifically on evening packing shifts and delivery routes, serving older parents and grandparents to be completed within 6 months. The clerk lifted her head at that. It was not a routine assignment. I said, I am not sending you somewhere random. I am sending you where care is repetitive, practical, and not about your mood. You will carry bags. You will arrive when you said you would arrive. You will look at people whose lives depend on whether someone shows up with respect. Then I gave the public and personal order. I said, within 30 days you will write a letter to your mother, not less than 1,000 words in your own hand, with no excuses, no blaming, and no use of the word if before the word hurt. On April 8, 2024, at the Dexter Street Community Center, you will read a 3-minute statement aloud before your probation officer, your school referral group, and your mother if she chooses to attend. I said, this is not for humiliation, it is for accuracy. You use language in this case to make harm sound smaller. I am requiring language that names it its true size. Then I gave the order that mattered most to Elena. I said, within 14 days, you will pay to have the apartment lock changed, provide the receipt to this court, and purchase a 6-month RIPTA-bus pass in your mother's name. You will also pay for 6 counseling sessions with a family therapist approved by probation to be used only if she chooses. I said, that is because your mother needs more than an apology. She needs practical safety. She needs a way to leave for work that does not depend on your choices. She needs to come home without wondering whether refusal will be treated like a challenge. Restitution means restoring what can still be restored. Sleep counts. Predictability counts. Subscribe. I will say it plainly. I owe it to her to keep telling this story. You subscribing is how her story reaches past this video. Subscribe and stay. Then I spoke to Marcus directly. I said, you took your mother's refusal and treated it like weather. You broke a frame that held your father's memory. You left the woman who fed you and housed you standing in a parking lot picking eggs up in the dark. What you did can be counted in dollars, but it cannot be understood only that way. I said, to your family, I offer no accusation and no false comfort. I will only say that love has carried too much weight in this house for too long. I said, at 18, one thing was required of you. When your mother said no, you were required to hear a full human being speaking. You chose instead to hear an obstacle. And then I ended where I needed to end. I said, this court will remember that Elena Rivera came here because she wanted to remain visible in her own life. When the sentence ended, the third silence arrived in full. Nobody moved. The officer near the wall kept one hand on his belt, and even that hand seemed to stop being a hand and become only stillness. Then the clerk set her pen down. That is the sound I still hear when I think of this case. Silence broke when Elena turned slightly toward her sister and said, I can breathe in my kitchen again. I have repeated that sentence to myself more than once since this case closed. Subscribe. I am not going to make a case for it. You are already in this story. Subscribe and let me finish it. As the courtroom began to empty, I stayed seated a moment longer. Marcus did not go first toward the door. He stepped toward the evidence envelope, looked down at the broken photograph of his parents, and stood still for 2 seconds without touching it. Elena's sister moved beside her and said, Come on, mija. Elena answered, Give me 1 minute. I was close enough to hear that. When I finally stood, the room looked smaller, as if truth had taken up more space than furniture. The appeal was filed on March 18, 2024. It was heard by the Rhode Island District Court 6th Division. On August 19, 2024, the ruling affirmed my findings and my sentence in full. In plain language, the appellate court said the orders were connected to the conduct explained clearly on the record, and aimed at repair as well as consequence. The whole process took 5 months and 1 day. I expected the appeal. I was not surprised when it came. On November 14, 2025, Marcus returned for a compliance review. He wore a gray warehouse work shirt with his name stitched above the pocket. Elena came in with him, not behind him. Before either of them sat down, he took a folded, ripped a bus pass sleeve from his jacket, put it in front of her, and said, "You keep this one." I am not going to tell you what that meant. I am only telling you it happened. The question I opened with still stays with me. What is a mother asking to be saved when she asks a court to teach respect? In this case, I think she was asking for reality to be restored, for no to mean no, for her work to count, for the air inside her own kitchen not to bend around somebody else's disregard. I have learned that grief and clarity are not opposites. If you sit with grief long enough and you do not rush to dress it up, it will often tell you exactly what was taken. So if you have ever worn the look Elena wore when she sat in front of me, then you know the feeling I mean, the feeling of measuring your own words inside your own home, the feeling of becoming careful around someone who should have been careful with you, the feeling of asking for plain respect and being made to feel unreasonable for asking. I recognized that in her face before she ever spoke. I have seen it before. To those of you living with that feeling now, I am not going to offer you a polished phrase. I will say this instead. Do not surrender your own scale to the person who keeps stepping on it. Write it down if you must. Say it plainly if you must. If private truth has been refused long enough, public truth is still truth. And to those of you who hear yourselves more in Marcus, there is one question I wanted to ask from the bench and could not, because it was not a legal question. When did you begin confusing access to someone with ownership of their peace? Sit with that. Then do one specific thing before today ends. Hand back the keys, literal or otherwise, and say one sentence that does not make your harm smaller. There are other people I want to speak for, other cases where someone needed a voice in that room and what they received instead was procedure. Subscribe and I will tell you those stories when I am ready to tell them. This was the first one I was ready for. I think often now of the grocery receipt Elena flattened on the table before anything began. A small piece of paper, one thing she could make lie still. I think of that, and I think of her sentence after it was over. I can breathe in my kitchen again. That is why I told you this story. If you want to hear the others, and there are others, subscribe. That is all I'm asking. Subscribe and stay. Use the comments the way a courtroom should sometimes be used better than it is, as a room where people tell the truth plainly and do not make each other smaller.